My son and his wife went on a cruise, leaving me to babysit my 8-year-old grandson who had been mute since birth. As soon as the door clicked shut, he stopped rocking, looked me dead in the eye, and whispered in a perfect voice. "Grandma, don't drink the tea Mom made for you," she plotted. My blood ran cold. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I never imagined that watching my 8-year-old grandson could turn my world upside down. At 66, I thought I'd experienced every surprise life could throw at me. I was wrong. The morning Dean and Nyla left for their 7-day cruise, I felt that familiar mix of joy and exhaustion that comes with caring for Damien. My grandson had been diagnosed as nonverbal since birth, and while I loved him deeply, our time together was always filled with silent gestures, patient waiting, and the constant ache of wondering what thoughts lived behind his bright brown eyes. "Mom, you're sure you can handle him for a week?" Dean asked for the 3rd time as he loaded their suitcases into the car. His voice carried that tone I'd grown to recognize over the years, love mixed with obligation, as if caring for his own mother was just another burden on his already full plate. "I've been caring for children since before you were born," I reminded him, adjusting my cardigan against the cool October morning. "Damien and I will be just fine." Nyla emerged from the house, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. She carried herself with that particular brand of confidence that comes from never having to doubt your place in the world. At 34, she had the kind of beauty that turned heads and the kind of ambition that never seemed satisfied with what she had. "Lucinda, I've prepared some special tea for you," she said, her voice honeyed with false concern. "The chamomile blend you love so much. I made enough to last the whole week. Just add hot water to the packets I left on the counter." I nodded gratefully, though something in her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's very thoughtful, dear. And remember," she continued, placing a manicured hand on my shoulder, "Damien's bedtime is exactly at 8 o'clock. He gets very agitated if his routine is disrupted. The pediatrician said consistency is crucial for children with his condition." Damien stood beside me, his small hand clasped in mine. He wore his favorite dinosaur shirt and carried the worn stuffed elephant he'd had since he was 2. To anyone watching, he appeared to be the picture of a special needs child, quiet, withdrawn, dependent on the adults around him for guidance and care. "We'll stick to his routine," I assured them, though privately I wondered how much of Damien's supposed need for rigid structure was real, and how much was just another way for Nyla to maintain control, even from a distance. After more hugs and repeated instructions, Dean and Nyla finally drove away, their luxury sedan disappearing around the corner toward the highway that would take them to the port. I stood on the front porch, waving until they were out of sight, Damien's hand still secure in mine. "Well, sweetheart," I said to him as we turned to go back inside, "it's just you and me for the next 7 days." He looked up at me with those intelligent eyes, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw something flicker there, a kind of awareness that seemed far beyond his supposed limitations. But then he was tugging me toward the house, eager to get to his toys, and I dismissed the feeling as wishful thinking. We spent the morning in the living room. I worked on my crossword puzzle while Damien arranged his action figures in elaborate patterns on the coffee table. The house felt different without Dean and Nyla's presence, quieter, but somehow more peaceful. The tension that usually hung in the air like invisible smoke had dissipated, leaving behind only the comfortable silence of 2 people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Around 11 o'clock, I decided to make myself some of the special tea Nyla had prepared. The packets were lined up neatly on the kitchen counter, each one labeled with careful handwriting. For Lucinda, chamomile comfort blend. I appreciated the gesture, though it struck me as unusually thoughtful for Nyla, who typically showed more interest in appearances than in genuine care. I filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove, then opened one of the packets. The dried flowers and herbs smelled lovely. Chamomile, yes, but also something else I couldn't quite identify. something with a slightly medicinal scent that seemed out of place in an herbal tea. As I waited for the water to boil, I heard Damien moving around in the living room. Usually, he played quietly, lost in his own world, but today he seemed restless. I could hear him walking back and forth, the old wooden floorboards creaking under his small feet. The kettle began to whistle, and I poured the hot water over the tea packet, watching the liquid slowly change color. It was darker than I expected for chamomile tea, with an almost amber hue that seemed more intense than anything I'd seen before. I was reaching for the honey when I heard it, a sound so unexpected, so impossible, that I nearly dropped the ceramic mug. "Grandma, don't drink that tea." The voice was small but clear, unmistakably real. I spun around to find Damien standing in the kitchen doorway, his brown eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that took my breath away. For 8 years, this child had never spoken a single word. For 8 years I'd wondered what his voice would sound like, what thoughts lived behind his silence. "Damien," I whispered, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Did you speak?" He stepped closer, his small hands clenched at his sides. "Grandma, please don't drink the tea. Mom put something in it. Something bad." The mug slipped from my nerveless fingers, crashing to the kitchen floor in an explosion of ceramic shards and steaming liquid. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence, but I barely noticed. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I'd just heard. "You can talk," I said, sinking into one of the kitchen chairs before my legs gave out entirely. "All this time, you could talk." Damien nodded solemnly, moving to stand beside my chair. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I wanted to tell you before, but I was scared. Mom said if I ever talked to anyone except when she said it was okay, something really bad would happen to you." "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me was already beginning to understand. The pieces were falling into place in a way that made my stomach turn with dread. "She makes me pretend," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "When other people are around, especially doctors, I have to act like I can't understand things. But I hear everything, Grandma. I see everything." I reached out with shaking hands and pulled him close, feeling the warm weight of his small body against mine. 8 years of silence, of thinking my grandson lived in a world I couldn't reach. 8 years of watching Nyla play the role of devoted mother caring for a special needs child. 8 years of believing the medical reports, the therapy sessions, the endless consultations with specialists. "What did she put in my tea?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Damien pulled back to look at me, his face serious beyond his years. "Medicine. The kind that makes you sleepy and confused. She's been doing it for a long time, Grandma. That's why you've been feeling so tired and forgetful lately." The room seemed to tilt around me as the full implication of his words sank in. Nyla had been drugging me. Slowly, systematically, deliberately. And she'd been using my own grandson as part of her deception, forcing him to maintain a lie that had shaped our entire family's understanding of who he was. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "A long time," he said. "I figured out how to read when I was 4, but I pretended I couldn't. I listen when Mom and Dad talk at night. They think I'm asleep, but I'm not." The courage it must have taken for this 8-year-old child to maintain such a pretense for years was staggering. To live in silence, to allow everyone to believe he was incapable of normal communication, all while understanding exactly what was happening around him. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked. "Because they're gone," he said simply. "And because I heard Mom talking on the phone yesterday. She said something about speeding things up while they were away. She made the tea packet stronger this time, Grandma. Much stronger." I looked at the mess on the floor where the mug had shattered, the dark liquid spreading across the white tiles like a stain of malevolent intent. If Damien hadn't spoken up, I would have drunk that tea without question. I would have trusted Nyla's false kindness, just as I'd been trusting it for months. We need to be very careful, I told him, my mind beginning to work through the implications. If your mother finds out that you told me. She won't, Damien said with a confidence that surprised me. I know how to pretend. I've been doing it my whole life. But now we can work together, Grandma. We can stop her. The determination in his young voice was both heartbreaking and inspiring. This child had been protecting himself and trying to protect me in the only way he could. Now, finally, we had a chance to protect each other. As I knelt to clean up the broken ceramic, my hands still trembling from shock and revelation, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family had just crumbled along with that mug. The next 7 days weren't going to be a simple week of babysitting my grandson. They were going to be a fight for both our futures. And for the first time in months, despite the fear and confusion swirling in my mind, I felt truly awake. The afternoon sun streamed through my kitchen windows as Damien and I sat at the small round table, sharing a lunch of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. It felt surreal. This ordinary moment made extraordinary by the fact that we were actually talking. For the first time in 8 years, I could hear my grandson's thoughts, his questions, his observations about the world around him. Tell me about the medicine, I said gently, cutting his sandwich into smaller pieces out of habit. How long has your mother been putting it in my tea? Damien chewed thoughtfully before answering. I think it started about 2 years ago. That's when you began sleeping more during your visits, and when Mom started saying you were getting confused about things. 2 years. I thought back to that time, remembering how Dean and Nyla had begun expressing concern about my memory. Little things at first, forgetting where I'd put my car keys, losing track of conversations mid-sentence, feeling overwhelmingly tired even after a full night's sleep. I'd attributed it to aging, maybe the beginning stages of cognitive decline that ran in my family. What exactly does she put in the tea? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Different pills, Damien said, his voice matter-of-fact in the way children can be about even terrible things. She crushes them up really fine. I watched her do it through the crack in their bedroom door. She has a little container where she keeps the powder, and she mixes it into the tea packets with a tiny spoon. The methodical nature of it made my stomach churn. This wasn't an impulsive act of desperation. It was calculated, planned, executed with the kind of precision that spoke to long-term intentions. Do you know what kind of pills? I pressed. Damien nodded, and his next words chilled me to the bone. Sleep medicine, but the really strong kind, and some white ones that she said were for making old people calm. I heard her tell Dad that if you took enough of them over time, it could cause something called cognitive decline, and that doctors would just think it was normal for someone your age. I set down my spoon, no longer able to pretend I had an appetite. The picture Damien was painting was of a systematic poisoning designed to make me appear mentally incompetent. The implications were staggering, not just for my health, but for my independence, my legal capacity, my ability to make decisions about my own life. Your father, I said carefully. Does he know? Damien's face crumpled slightly, and I saw the pain of a child forced to confront ugly truths about the people who should protect him. At first, he didn't want to listen, but Mom kept talking about how much money it costs to take care of you as you get older, and how it would be better for everyone if you just went to sleep and didn't wake up. The words hit me like a physical blow. My own son, discussing my death as if it were a financial planning decision. Dad doesn't like it, Damien continued quickly, seeing my expression. He gets upset when Mom talks that way. But he's scared of her, Grandma. Just like I am. She gets really angry when people don't do what she wants. I reached across the table and took his small hand in mine. What does she do when she gets angry? She doesn't hit or anything, he said, which should have been reassuring but somehow wasn't. But she has ways of making people sorry they didn't listen. Like when I was 5 and I accidentally said mama in front of the doctor. She told me later that if I ever spoke again when I wasn't supposed to, She'd send me away to a special hospital where I'd never see you or Dad again. The threat was as cruel as it was effective. A 5-year-old child, just beginning to understand the world around him, silenced by the terror of losing everyone he loved. She said the doctors there would give me shots that would make me sleep all the time, and that no one would ever believe anything I said even if I tried to tell them what happened, he continued. She said some children go to places like that and their families forget about them completely. I had to blink back tears of rage and sorrow. The psychological manipulation of a small child, the weaponizing of his natural fears and dependencies. It was a level of cruelty that I was still struggling to fully comprehend. "But you're very smart," I said, squeezing his hand. "Smarter than she thinks you are." "I had to be," Damien said simply. "I started paying attention to everything after that. I learned to read by watching TV when no one was looking. I figured out how to understand what adults were really saying, not just the words they used in front of me." The resilience of this child amazed me. While other 8-year-olds were playing video games and complaining about homework, Damien had been conducting a covert survival operation, gathering intelligence that might someday save both our lives. "What else have you learned?" I asked. "Mom has been researching things on her computer," he said. "She doesn't know I can read, so sometimes she leaves it open when she goes to get coffee. I've seen pages about something called elder abuse and how hard it is to prove, and lots of stuff about natural causes and expected decline in elderly patients." Each revelation was another piece of a horrifying puzzle. Nyla wasn't just poisoning me impulsively. She was educating herself on how to do it effectively, how to avoid detection, how to make my eventual death appear natural and expected. "She also looks up information about kids like me," Damien continued. "Children with developmental disabilities and how they make unreliable witnesses if anything bad ever happened." The full scope of her planning was breathtaking in its malevolence. She wasn't just using Damien's forced silence to cover her tracks. She was researching how his supposed disability would protect her if he ever tried to expose her. "There's something else," Damien said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "She's been making the tea stronger each time. Yesterday, when she was packing the packets for this week, I heard her on the phone with someone. She said she was tired of waiting for nature to take its course and that it was time to move the timeline up." My blood ran cold. If Nyla was planning to accelerate whatever process she'd begun 2 years ago, then this week, while she and Dean were safely on a cruise ship with hundreds of witnesses to their whereabouts, might be intended as my last. "Who was she talking to on the phone?" I asked. "I don't know," Damien said. "But whoever it was, they were helping her plan. They talked about how much medicine would be enough and how to make sure there wouldn't be an investigation afterward." The scope of the conspiracy was expanding beyond just my daughter-in-law's greed. There was someone else involved, someone providing expertise or encouragement or both. "Damien," I said, choosing my words carefully, "do you understand what your mother is trying to do to me?" He nodded solemnly. "She wants you to die, Grandma. She thinks if you die, Dad will inherit your house and all your money, and then she'll be able to control it because Dad does whatever she tells him to." Out of the mouths of babes. This 8-year-old child had grasped the essential truth that I'd been too trusting, too loving to see clearly. Nyla viewed me not as a person, not as family, but as an obstacle standing between her and a $450,000 house plus my life savings. "But here's what she doesn't know," I said, feeling a spark of defiant determination ignite in my chest. "I'm not as easy to get rid of as she thinks. And now I have something she never counted on." "What's that?" Damien asked. "I have you," I told him, "and you're the smartest, bravest person I've ever met." A smile, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years, spread across his face. "What are we going to do?" I looked around my kitchen, this comfortable space that had always felt like the heart of my home. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, and soon it would be evening. Dean and Nyla were somewhere in the middle of the ocean, probably toasting their cleverness with champagne while they waited for news that their problem had solved itself. "We're going to be very careful," I said. "We're going to document everything. And we're going to make sure that when this week is over, your mother faces the consequences of what she's tried to do to both of us." "But how?" Damien asked. "Adults never believe kids, especially kids like me who aren't supposed to be able to talk." It was a valid concern. The very disability that Nyla had forced upon him would make his testimony suspect, but I had an advantage she didn't know about. "Leave that to me," I said. "Your job is to keep being exactly who you've been pretending to be when other people are around. Can you do that?" "I've been doing it for 8 years," he said with a confidence that broke my heart and filled me with pride simultaneously. As we finished our lunch, I began to formulate a plan. Nyla had made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated both her victims. She saw me as a confused old woman too addled to recognize what was happening to her. She saw Damien as a disabled child too limited to understand or communicate the truth. She was wrong on both counts. And by the time Dean and Nyla returned from their cruise, I intended to have enough evidence to ensure that my grandson and I would never have to fear her again. The real question was whether we could gather that evidence before the concentrated doses of whatever she'd put in this week's tea packets accomplished what 2 years of gradual poisoning had failed to do. Time was running out, but for the first time in months, I wasn't facing that deadline alone. The second day without Dean and Nyla brought a strange sense of clarity to my home. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't fighting the fog that had become my constant companion. My mind felt sharp, alert in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. The absence of Nyla's special tea was like emerging from underwater and finally being able to breathe. Damien and I had spent the evening before developing what we called our safety plan. During the day, when neighbors might see us through windows or visitors might stop by, he would return to his role as the silent, withdrawn child everyone expected. But in the privacy of my home, when we were certain we were alone, he could be himself. Brilliant, observant, and heartbreakingly mature for his 8 years. "Grandma," he said over breakfast, his voice still carrying that note of wonder that came from finally being allowed to speak freely. "I need to show you something, but we have to be really careful about it." "What kind of something?" I asked, though the serious expression on his face already had me bracing for another revelation. "Mom's research," he said. "She printed some things and hid them in my room. She thought I couldn't read them, so she figured it was the safest place to keep them." We made our way upstairs to the small guest bedroom that served as Damien's space during our visits. It was decorated with cheerful dinosaur wallpaper that I'd put up when he was 4, thinking it might encourage him to be more communicative. Now, knowing what I knew, the bright creatures seemed to watch us with knowing eyes. Damien went to his dresser and carefully moved aside his folded clothes. Hidden underneath, wrapped in one of his old receiving blankets, was a manila folder. "She checks on this sometimes," he explained in a whisper, though we'd already confirmed the house was empty. "She thinks I just play with the blanket because it's soft, but really, I'm making sure she doesn't move the papers." He handed me the folder with the solemnity of a child passing along state secrets. In many ways, that's exactly what it was. The first document made my hands tremble. It was a printout from a medical website titled "Signs of Natural Cognitive Decline in Elderly Patients." Someone, Nyla, I assumed, had highlighted specific sections in yellow marker. Progressive memory loss. Increased confusion and disorientation. Changes in sleep patterns and appetite. Difficulty with complex tasks. Every highlighted symptom was something I'd experienced over the past 2 years. Symptoms that had convinced my own son that his mother was sliding into dementia. The second document was worse. It was an article about when elderly parents become a burden, making difficult decisions about care. The margins were filled with handwritten notes in Nyla's precise script. Nursing home costs $15,000 per month minimum. Legal complications of incompetency proceedings. Timeline considerations. But it was the third document that made my blood run cold. Medication interactions in elderly patients, accidental overdoses and their prevention, read the title. This article had been annotated more heavily than the others. Passages about how certain combinations of sleep aids and anti-anxiety medications could cause respiratory depression in older adults were underlined multiple times. There were calculations in the margins, dosages, timing intervals, notes about how to space administration to avoid immediate detection. "Damien," I said, my voice barely steady, "where did your mother get these medications?" "Different places," he said, settling beside me on the small bed. "Some she got from doctors by saying she was having trouble sleeping. Some she ordered online using fake names. And some—" He hesitated, and I could see he was struggling with something particularly difficult to share. "Some she got from Mrs. Henderson next door," he finished in a rush. Mrs. Henderson was my elderly neighbor, a sweet woman in her 70s who lived alone with her 3 cats. I'd been checking on her regularly, especially since her hip surgery last year. "Mrs. Henderson?" I repeated. "How?" "Mom volunteers to pick up her prescriptions sometimes," Damien explained. "Mrs. Henderson has really strong pain medicine and sleep pills because of her surgery. Mom always offers to help, and Mrs. Henderson is grateful because it's hard for her to get to the pharmacy." The picture was becoming clearer and more horrifying. Nyla had been systematically collecting medications from multiple sources, building an arsenal of drugs that could be combined in ways that would appear accidental to anyone who didn't know to look for a pattern. "There's more," Damien said quietly. He reached into the folder and pulled out a handwritten list. "She's been keeping track." The list was titled LM, Progress Notes in Nyla's Careful Handwriting. LM, my initials, Lucinda Morrison. Below the header were dates spanning the past 2 years, each with brief notations. March 15th, first dose administered, no immediate reaction. Appears tired but attributes to normal aging. April 2nd, increased dosage slightly. Subject reported feeling foggy but did not express suspicion. June 10th, noticeable improvement in compliance. Subject more confused, easier to manipulate. September 3rd, breakthrough episode. Subject became temporarily lucid and questioned memory issues. Decreased dose for 1 week to avoid suspicion. The clinical detachment of the language was almost worse than the content. Nyla had been treating my gradual poisoning like a scientific experiment, carefully documenting my decline with the same attention to detail she might give to a recipe or a budget. The most recent entries were the most chilling. October 1st, timeline acceleration necessary. Financial pressures increasing. Subject must be eliminated before next quarterly financial review. October 10th, prepared concentrated doses for cruise week. Calculated amounts should be sufficient for permanent resolution within 48 to 72 hours of administration. I set the papers down with shaking hands. Nyla hadn't just been slowly poisoning me, she'd been planning a specific timeline for my death. And that timeline placed it squarely during the week she and Dean would be on their cruise, establishing perfect alibis while I supposedly succumbed to natural causes in my own home. "Grandma?" Damien's voice was small and worried. "Are you okay?" I looked at this remarkable child who'd been protecting both of us in the only way he could, maintaining his silence to keep us safe while gathering evidence that might save our lives. The courage it must have taken to live with this knowledge, to watch the woman who claimed to be his mother plot the death of the grandmother who truly loved him. "I'm okay," I told him, though I wasn't sure that was entirely true. "But we need to be even more careful than we thought." "What do you mean?" I showed him the final entry on Nyla's list. His face went pale as he read the words about permanent resolution. "She's not planning to wait for the medicine to work slowly," I explained gently. "She's planning to give me enough this week to make sure I don't wake up at all." Damien was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the serious consideration of someone far older than his years. Finally, he looked up at me with determined eyes. Then we have to stop her before she gets back, he said. How? We document everything, he said, echoing my words from the day before. But not just the papers. We need proof that I can really talk, proof that she's been lying about me, and proof about the medicine. He was right. The documents were damning, but they could potentially be dismissed as circumstantial evidence. What we needed was irrefutable proof of Nyla's intentions and methods. I have an idea, I said slowly, a plan beginning to form in my mind. But it's going to require you to be very brave. I've been brave my whole life, Grandma, he said simply. I can keep being brave a little longer. That afternoon, while Damien napped, a real nap, not the drugged stupor that Nyla's medications would have induced, I made several important phone calls. First, I called my lawyer, Margaret Chen, who'd been handling my affairs for the past 15 years. Lucinda, Margaret's warm voice came through clearly. How wonderful to hear from you. How are you feeling? Dean mentioned you'd been having some memory issues. The fact that Dean had been discussing my supposed cognitive decline with my lawyer was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Had he been laying groundwork for some kind of incompetency proceeding? Actually, Margaret, I'm feeling better than I have in months, I said carefully. But I need to ask you about something important. Hypothetically, if someone were systematically giving an elderly person medications without their knowledge, what kind of evidence would be needed to prove it? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Lucinda, is there something specific you're concerned about? Potentially, I said. I'd rather not go into details over the phone, but I may need your help very soon. Of course. To answer your hypothetical question, the most compelling evidence would be medical testimony showing the presence of unprescribed medications in the person's system, combined with documentation of intent and means. Video evidence would be ideal, but often difficult to obtain. Video evidence. The idea sparked something in my mind. What about audio recordings? I asked. If someone were to confess to this kind of activity? Audio recordings can be admissible depending on the circumstances and local laws. But Lucinda, if you're in immediate danger, you should contact the police. I'm safe for now, I assured her, which was true as long as I continued to avoid anything Nyla had prepared for me to consume. But I may need you to be ready to act quickly when the time comes. After I hung up with Margaret, I made my second call, to my doctor, Dr. Patricia Reeves, who'd been treating me for the past decade. Dr. Reeves, I said when she came on the line, I need to ask you about the memory issues I've been experiencing. Is it possible that they could be caused by medication rather than natural aging? Absolutely, she said without hesitation. Drug interactions, particularly in older patients, can cause symptoms that closely mimic dementia. Have you been taking any new medications? Even over-the-counter supplements can sometimes cause problems. That's what I'm trying to figure out, I said. If I wanted to test for the presence of medications I hadn't knowingly taken, what would that involve? A comprehensive blood panel and urinalysis could detect most common medications, she explained. Though some substances metabolize quickly, so timing is important. Lucinda, this sounds serious. Are you concerned that someone might be giving you medication without your knowledge? It's possible, I admitted. Would you be able to run those tests if I came in tomorrow? Of course. I'll have my nurse set up an appointment for first thing in the morning. As I hung up the phone, I felt the first stirring of hope I'd experienced in months. We had documentation of Nyla's plans. We would soon have medical evidence of her actions. And now, thanks to an idea that was still forming, we might be able to get the audio confession that would tie everything together. But first, we needed to set a trap. And for that trap to work, Nyla would have to believe that her plan was proceeding exactly as she'd intended. When Damien woke up from his nap, I explained what we were going to do. His eyes widened as he understood the implications, but he nodded with the same determined courage he'd shown throughout this ordeal. She's going to call tonight to check on things, he said. She always does on the second day. Perfect, I said, though the word felt strange considering what we were planning. When she calls, we're going to give her exactly what she expects to hear. As evening approached, I felt the weight of what we were attempting. We were about to enter the most dangerous phase of our plan, convincing Nyla that her scheme was working, while gathering evidence that would eventually destroy her. The phone rang at exactly 8 o'clock, just as Damien had predicted. As I reached for the receiver, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. For the first time in 2 years, my eyes looked clear and focused. Nyla was about to discover that her victim was much more awake than she'd planned. "Hello, Lucinda?" Nyla's voice came through the phone with that perfectly modulated tone of concern she'd mastered over the years. "How are you and Damien getting along?" I had positioned myself at the kitchen table where I could see Damien in the living room. He was playing quietly with his action figures, but I knew he was listening to every word. We'd rehearsed this conversation, and now it was time for both of us to give the performance of our lives. "Oh, hello, dear," I said, deliberately letting my voice sound tired and slightly confused. We're doing fine, I think. Though I have to admit I've been feeling quite tired. More than usual." "Oh no," Nyla said, and I could hear the barely contained satisfaction beneath her false sympathy. "Have you been drinking the tea I prepared for you? It should help with that." Yes, I have," I lied smoothly. "It tastes a bit stronger than usual, but you always know what's best." There was a pause, and I could practically hear Nyla calculating in her head. If I'd been drinking the concentrated tea packets she'd prepared, I should be showing signs of serious impairment by now. "How has your appetite been?" she asked, and I recognized the question as a way of assessing whether the medications were affecting me as expected. "Not very good," I admitted, which was actually true. The stress of discovering the truth about her plans had definitely affected my eating. "I've been feeling rather nauseous, and sometimes confused about what time it is." "That's completely normal at your age, Lucinda," Nyla said, and I had to grip the phone tighter to keep from responding to the condescending tone. "Have you been taking your regular medications as well?" This was a trap. If I said yes, she'd know that the combination of her doctored tea and my legitimate prescriptions should be creating dangerous interactions. If I said no, she might become suspicious about why I wasn't following my normal routine. "I think so," I said, letting uncertainty creep into my voice. "To be honest, I've been having trouble remembering things. Yesterday I couldn't remember if I'd fed Damien lunch, and this morning I found my car keys in the refrigerator." The car keys detail was fabricated, but it was exactly the kind of confusion that would indicate the medications were affecting my cognitive function in the way she intended. "Oh my," Nyla said, and now the satisfaction in her voice was unmistakable. "That does sound concerning. Maybe when we get back we should talk about getting you some additional help around the house." Additional help. Code for beginning the process of declaring me incompetent and taking control of my affairs. "How is Damien handling all this?" she continued. "Is he being difficult? Sometimes children can sense when adults are having problems, and it makes them act out." I looked at my grandson, who was listening intently while arranging his toys. The idea that this remarkable, intelligent child had been dismissed and silenced for years because of his supposed limitations filled me with renewed anger. "He's been very quiet," I said truthfully. "More withdrawn than usual. He seems to spend a lot of time just sitting and watching me." "That's probably for the best," Nyla said dismissively. "The less stimulation you have to deal with, the better. Just make sure he stays out of your way and doesn't cause any additional stress." The casual way she discussed her own son, as if he were nothing more than a potential inconvenience, was chilling. This woman had no real love for either of us. We were simply obstacles or tools to be managed in service of her larger goals. "Lucinda," she continued, her voice taking on what she probably thought was a caring tone. "I want you to promise me something. If you start feeling worse, if you have any dizzy spells or trouble breathing, don't try to drive anywhere. Just rest, okay? Sometimes the best thing for someone your age is just to lie down and let your body recover naturally. The implication was clear. She was expecting, hoping, that I would experience exactly those symptoms. And when I did, her advice was to isolate myself and avoid seeking help. "Of course, dear," I said. "You're so thoughtful to worry about me." "That's what family is for," she replied. And the hypocrisy of those words from someone who was actively plotting my death was almost overwhelming. After a few more minutes of false pleasantries and manufactured concern, Nyla ended the call. I sat in the kitchen for several minutes afterward, my hands still trembling with suppressed rage. "You did great, Grandma," Damien said, appearing beside me. She totally believed it. "How could you tell?" "Her voice gets different when she's really happy about something," he explained with the observational skills of a child who'd learned to read adults for his own survival. "It gets kind of sing-song, even when she's trying to sound worried. She was happy that you sounded confused." The fact that an 8-year-old had to develop such sophisticated understanding of manipulation and deception just to feel safe in his own home was heartbreaking. "Now what?" he asked. "Now we document everything," I said, "and tomorrow we start gathering the evidence that's going to stop her." That evening, I helped Damien write down everything he could remember about his mother's activities over the past 2 years. His recall was extraordinary. He could remember specific conversations, dates when unusual medications appeared in the house, times when Neela had made suspicious phone calls or spent time on her computer researching things she didn't think he could understand. "She keeps a journal," he told me as we worked. "She writes in it every night before bed. She thinks I'm asleep, but I've seen her doing it." "What kind of journal?" "A little blue book that she keeps in her nightstand. She writes about money stuff mostly, but sometimes about you and Dad and me. I saw her writing in it the night before they left for the cruise." A journal would be invaluable evidence, but it was currently locked away in Nyla and Dean's bedroom. However, Damien's information about it would be crucial if and when the police needed to know where to look. The next morning, I kept my appointment with Dr. Reeves. I explained my concerns about possible medication tampering, though I was careful not to reveal too many details about our ongoing investigation. She drew blood for a comprehensive drug screen and assured me the results would be available by the following day. "Lucinda," she said as we finished, "if someone has been giving you medications without your knowledge, that's a serious crime. Have you contacted the police?" "I'm gathering evidence first," I told her. "I want to make sure I have everything I need before I make accusations that could tear my family apart." She nodded understandingly, though I could see the concern in her eyes. "Please be careful. If you're right about this, you could be in real danger." When I returned home, Damien was waiting anxiously by the front window. "How did it go?" he asked. "We should know tomorrow if there are drugs in my system that shouldn't be there," I told him. "But now we need to work on the next part of our plan." "The recording?" I nodded. That morning, I'd purchased a small digital recorder, the kind students use to record lectures. It was tiny enough to hide easily, and the audio quality was surprisingly good. Our plan was to use it to capture Nyla incriminating herself when she returned from the cruise. But first, we needed to practice our strategy. When Dean and Nyla returned, they would expect to find me in a much worse condition than I actually was. I needed to be able to convincingly portray someone who'd been heavily medicated for several days, while Damien continued his role as the silent, observant child he'd been pretending to be for years. We spent the afternoon rehearsing. Damien coached me on how to appear confused and disoriented without overdoing it. Having watched the real effects of his mother's medications on me over the past 2 years, he was an excellent judge of what would seem believable. "You slur your words a little when you're really tired," he instructed. "And you repeat yourself sometimes, like you forget you already said something." "How do you know all this?" I asked, amazed once again by his observational skills. "I had to learn," he said simply. "I needed to know when you were really sick from the medicine and when you were just having a normal tired day," so I could take better care of you when Mom and Dad weren't paying attention. This child had been protecting me for 2 years, in small ways I'd never even noticed. Making sure I sat down when I seemed unsteady, bringing me water when the medications made me thirsty, staying close when I appeared confused, all while maintaining his facade of disability and silence. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, I realized how much had changed in just 3 days. My mind was clearer than it had been in months. I felt stronger, more like myself than I had since this nightmare began. And most importantly, I was no longer alone in the fight for my life. "Grandma?" Damien said as we cleaned up the dishes. "After we stop Mom, what's going to happen to me?" It was the question I'd been dreading, because the answer was complicated. If Nyla was arrested and Dean was found complicit in her plans, Damien would need a new guardian. The thought of this remarkable child being placed in the foster care system was unbearable. But legally, I wasn't sure what options we would have. "I don't know exactly," I told him honestly. "But I promise you this, whatever happens, I will never let you be hurt again. And I will never let anyone force you to be silent again." He nodded solemnly, and I could see that he understood the uncertainty we were facing. But there was also trust in his eyes, trust that we would figure it out together. "2 more days," he said quietly. 2 more days until Dean and Nyla returned from their cruise, expecting to find a very different situation than what would actually be waiting for them. 2 more days to finalize our preparations and steel ourselves for what might be the most important confrontation of our lives. As I tucked Damien into bed that night, he looked up at me with those intelligent brown eyes that had been watching and learning and protecting for far too long. "Grandma," he whispered, "I'm not scared anymore." "Why not?" I asked. "Because now you know the truth," he said. "And the truth is stronger than anything Mom can do." I kissed his forehead and turned off the light, hoping with all my heart that he was right. Tomorrow would bring the test results that would either confirm or disprove our suspicions about the poisoning. And the day after that would bring the confrontation that would determine both our futures. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, I felt like we might actually win. The morning Dean and Nyla were scheduled to return, I received the call that confirmed our worst fears and gave us our strongest weapon. "Lucinda." Dr. Reeves's voice was grave over the phone. "The blood work results are back, and I need you to come in immediately. Better yet, I think we should involve the police." "What did you find?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be damning. "Your system shows dangerous levels of multiple medications that aren't on your prescription list," she said. "Lorazepam, diphenhydramine, and something called zolpidem, all in concentrations that could cause serious cognitive impairment or worse. Lucinda, someone has been systematically poisoning you." The clinical confirmation of what Damien and I had discovered sent a chill through me, but it also filled me with a fierce sense of vindication. We weren't crazy. We weren't paranoid. We were victims of a calculated attempt at murder. "How long would it take for these medications to leave my system?" I asked. "Given the concentrations, you've been drug-free for approximately 72 to 96 hours, she calculated. "Which explains why you've been feeling clearer lately. Lucinda, these dosages, if someone had continued increasing them, the outcome could have been fatal." Fatal. The word hung in the air like a death sentence that had been narrowly avoided. After hanging up with Dr. Reeves, I found Damien in the living room, back in his silent role as he practiced for his parents' return. But his eyes met mine with an intelligence that no one else had bothered to notice for 8 years. "The doctor confirmed everything," I told him quietly. "The drugs, the danger, all of it." He nodded solemnly, then pointed to the small digital recorder we'd hidden behind the books on my shelf. Everything was ready for the confrontation that would determine both our futures. At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, I heard the familiar sound of Dean's car pulling into the driveway. Through the window, I watched my son and daughter-in-law emerge from their vehicle, tanned and relaxed from their week of luxury, while they waited for news of my demise. Nyla moved with the confident stride of someone who believed her plan had succeeded. Dean looked tired, probably from the internal stress of what he'd agreed to participate in, but he was here nonetheless. I positioned myself in the living room armchair, slumping slightly and letting my hair appear more disheveled than usual. Damien sat on the floor near my feet, playing silently with his toys, but ready to spring into action when the moment came. The front door opened without a knock. Nyla had insisted on keeping a spare key for emergencies. "Lucinda?" Nyla's voice called out, pitched with false concern. "We're back. How are you feeling?" "I'm in here," I called back, making my voice sound weak and confused. They entered the living room, and I watched Nyla's face carefully as she took in my appearance. Satisfaction flickered in her eyes before she quickly masked it with worry. "Oh my goodness," she said, rushing toward me. "You look terrible. Have you been taking care of yourself?" I've been having trouble," I said, letting my words slur slightly. "Trouble remembering things. The tea helped, but I've been so tired." "I can see that," Nyla said, placing a cool hand on my forehead in a mockery of maternal care. "Dean, look at your mother. She's declined so much in just 1 week." Dean hung back near the doorway, his face pale and uncomfortable. "Mom, are you okay?" "She's been like this since we left," Nyla answered for me, which was exactly what I'd hoped she would do. "Getting worse every day. I think it might be time to seriously consider our conversation about alternative living arrangements." Alternative living arrangements. A nursing home, where I would be even more isolated and vulnerable to whatever final plans she had for me. "I don't understand what's happening to me," I said, reaching for the confusion and fear that had been all too real over the past 2 years. "Sometimes I can't remember if I've eaten or what day it is. Yesterday I woke up and didn't know where I was for several minutes. That's completely normal," Nyla said soothingly, and I could hear the barely contained excitement in her voice. "These things happen with age. The important thing is that you have family who cares about you." Family who cares. The woman who had been slowly poisoning me for 2 years was lecturing me about family care. "Nyla," I said, looking up at her with what I hoped appeared to be grateful trust. "I want to thank you for taking such good care of me, for making sure I have everything I need." "Of course," she said, preening slightly. "That's what daughters-in-law are for." "Especially the tea," I continued, watching her face carefully. "You always make sure I have the right tea to help with my problems." Something shifted in her expression, a sharpening of attention that told me she was calculating dosages and timelines in her head. "Have you been drinking all of it?" she asked. "The packets I prepared are stronger than usual. They should help with the sleep issues you've been having." "Oh yes," I assured her. "I've been very careful to drink it exactly as you instructed. Every morning and every evening, just like you said." The lie came easily now. I was fighting for both our lives, and there was no room for moral qualms about deception. "Good," Nyla said, and the satisfaction in her voice was unmistakable. "Consistency is so important with medical issues." Medical issues. She was still maintaining the fiction that she was helping rather than harming me. Dean finally approached, sitting heavily in the chair across from me. "Mom, have you talked to Dr. Reeves lately? Maybe we should schedule an appointment to discuss these memory problems." "Actually," Nyla interjected quickly, "I think Lucinda might be beyond what Dr. Reeves can help with at this point. We might need to consult with a specialist, someone who deals with more serious cognitive decline. A specialist who would be primed to see exactly what Nyla wanted them to see. An elderly woman whose mental faculties had deteriorated to the point where she needed intensive care." "I don't want to be a burden," I said, letting my voice break slightly. "If you think it would be better for me to go somewhere else." "Oh, Mom," Dean said, and I could hear genuine pain in his voice. Whatever role he'd played in this scheme, seeing me like this was clearly affecting him. You're not a burden. We just want what's best for you. What's best, Nyla agreed, is professional care from people who understand these conditions. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Nyla was comfortable now, confident that her plan had succeeded, and eager to move into the next phase. It was time to spring our trap. "Damien," I said softly, reaching down to touch my grandson's shoulder. "Could you get Grandma a glass of water? I feel a little dizzy." Damien looked up at me and our eyes met for just a moment. He nodded and stood up. But instead of heading toward the kitchen, he moved to the bookshelf where our digital recorder was hidden. "What's he doing?" Nyla asked, distracted by the unexpected behavior. "Damien, the kitchen is that way." Damien ignored her, reaching behind the books and retrieving the small device. As he turned around, holding it in his small hands, Nyla's face went white. "Damien?" Dean said, confusion clear in his voice. "What do you have there?" And then, for the second time in my grandson's life, he spoke in front of his parents. "It's a recorder," he said clearly, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent room. "I've been recording everything for Grandma, including all the times Mom talked about the medicine she's been putting in the tea." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Nyla lurched backward as if she'd been physically struck. Dean's mouth fell open, his face cycling through confusion, shock, and dawning horror. "That's impossible," Nyla whispered. "He doesn't speak. He can't speak." "I can speak," Damien said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've always been able to speak. You just made me too scared to do it in front of anyone." "Damien?" Dean's voice was barely audible. "You. How long have you been able to talk?" "My whole life," Damien said, moving to stand beside my chair. "But Mom told me that if I ever spoke when I wasn't supposed to, she'd send me away and hurt Grandma. So I learned to stay quiet." The truth was pouring out now. 8 years of forced silence finally broken. And with each word, I watched Nyla's carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "This is impossible," she repeated, her voice rising. "He's developmentally disabled. The doctors confirmed it. The tests." "The tests you influenced," I said, my own voice suddenly clear and strong as I dropped the pretense of confusion. "Just like you influenced everything else." Nyla spun toward me, her face twisted with rage and panic. "You, how are you?" "How am I coherent?" I finished for her. "Probably because I haven't been drinking your special tea for the past 5 days." The admission hung in the air like a bomb. Dean was looking back and forth between us, his face pale with growing understanding. "What tea?" he asked weakly. "What are you talking about?" "The tea your wife has been using to slowly poison me for the past 2 years, I said, standing up with more strength than I'd felt in months. "The tea laced with medications designed to make me appear senile and confused. The tea that was supposed to kill me this week while you were safely on your cruise." "That's insane," Nyla said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're having another episode, Lucinda. You're confused." "Am I?" I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out the folder of documents Damien had shown me. "Then explain these." I opened the folder and began reading from her own handwritten notes. October 10th, prepared concentrated doses for cruise week. Calculated amounts should be sufficient for permanent resolution within 48 to 72 hours of administration. The color drained from Nyla's face as she recognized her own words. Dean looked like he was going to be sick. "Permanent resolution, Nyla," I continued. "Is that what you call murdering your husband's mother?" "I never." She started, then stopped, realizing that anything she said could only make things worse. "And Damien," I said, placing my hand on my grandson's shoulder, "has been protecting both of us the only way he could, by staying silent and watching, by gathering evidence, by being brave enough to finally speak when it mattered most." Dean was staring at his son with a mixture of wonder and horror. "Damien? Is this true? Has your mother been?" "She's been hurting Grandma for a long time," Damien said simply. "And she made me promise to never tell anyone I could talk, or she'd make you send me away forever." The manipulation, the psychological abuse, the systematic destruction of a family through fear and deception. It was all out in the open now. And Nyla, faced with the collapse of her schemes, was beginning to show her true nature. "You have no proof," she said, but her voice was shaking. "A confused old woman and a mentally disabled child? No one will believe you." "Actually," I said, reaching for my phone, "I think Dr. Reeves will be very interested in these blood test results showing dangerous levels of medications I never took. And Detective Morrison will be fascinated by your research notes about accidental overdoses in elderly patients." As I dialed the numbers I'd already programmed into my phone, Nyla made a last desperate play. She lunged toward Damien, probably hoping to intimidate him back into silence. She never reached him. 8 years of pent-up protective fury gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I stepped between them, and for the first time in this entire nightmare, I let my anger show. "Don't you dare touch him," I said, my voice carrying an authority that stopped her cold. "You've terrorized this child long enough." The sirens were already audible in the distance. Justice was finally coming to my house. 9 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my home, watching Damien help me roll out dough for chocolate chip cookies. The afternoon sun streamed through windows that no longer felt like barriers against threats, but simply openings to let in light and warmth. "Can I add the vanilla now, Grandma?" Damien asked, his voice carrying the natural curiosity and joy of a child who no longer had to hide his intelligence. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, marveling as I did every day at the simple pleasure of having real conversations with my grandson. The legal proceedings had been swift once the evidence was presented. Dr. Reeves's blood tests, combined with Nyla's own documented research and planning notes, had built an airtight case for attempted murder. The recording Damien and I had made during that final confrontation had captured Nyla essentially confessing to her crimes. But perhaps most damaging of all had been Damien's testimony. When child psychologists evaluated him and confirmed that he was not only capable of normal communication, but was exceptionally intelligent, it destroyed every foundation of Nyla's defense. She had been revealed as someone who had forced her own child into years of unnecessary silence while simultaneously plotting the murder of an elderly family member. The judge had shown no mercy. Nyla was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder, elder abuse, and child endangerment. The fact that she had been systematically poisoning me while presenting herself as my caregiver had particularly outraged the court. Dean's fate had been more complicated. The prosecution had initially considered charging him as an accessory, but his cooperation with the investigation and his genuine remorse had ultimately led to a plea agreement. He received 5 years probation and was required to undergo psychological counseling to address his failure to protect both his mother and his son from his wife's abuse. More importantly for our family's future, Dean had voluntarily relinquished custody of Damien to me. He recognized that his passivity had enabled years of psychological torture for his child, and he wanted what was best for Damien's recovery and development. "The court psychologist says I might catch up to my grade level by next year," Damien said as he carefully measured vanilla extract. "She says I'm probably smarter than most kids my age, even though I missed so much school." "I'm not surprised," I told him honestly. "You were smart enough to protect both of us for years. A little catch-up work in math and reading will be nothing for you." The transformation in Damien over the past 6 months had been remarkable to witness. Free from the constant fear that had governed his life, he had blossomed into the bright, curious, talkative child he'd always been meant to be. His teachers were amazed by his rapid progress, and his therapist said his resilience was extraordinary. "Dr. Martinez wants to know if you'll come to my session next week," Damien said, referring to the child psychologist who had been helping him process years of trauma. "She says she wants to talk about family dynamics and healing." "Of course I'll come," I assured him. We're in this together, remember? The healing process hadn't been easy for either of us. I'd had to confront the reality that I'd failed to protect my grandson from years of abuse, even though I hadn't known it was happening. The guilt of that knowledge had been almost overwhelming, until Dr. Martinez helped me understand that Nyla had been victimizing both of us simultaneously. You were being systematically poisoned and psychologically manipulated, she'd explained during one of our joint sessions. You couldn't protect Damien because you were fighting for your own survival, often without even realizing it. What matters now is that you're both safe and working together to heal. The financial aftermath had been significant but manageable. My medical treatment to clear the remaining medications from my system had been extensive, and Damien needed ongoing therapy to address his trauma. But the life insurance policy Nyla had been so eager to claim was now funding our recovery instead. More importantly, we discovered that the house was truly ours. Nyla's plans to inherit everything had been based on the assumption that I would die before making any changes to my will. Instead, I'd been able to update my legal documents to ensure that Damien would be provided for no matter what happened to me. "Grandma," Damien said as we slid the cookie sheets into the oven, "do you think Dad will ever come see us again?" It was a question he asked periodically, and I always answered it honestly. Dean had visited twice since his sentencing, awkward encounters where he'd tried to rebuild some kind of relationship with his son. But the damage was profound, and healing would take time, if it was even possible. "I don't know," I told Damien. "Your father is dealing with his own guilt and shame about what happened. He knows he failed to protect you, and that's very hard for him to face." "I don't hate him," Damien said thoughtfully. "I just wish he'd been stronger." The wisdom in that statement never ceased to amaze me. This 9-year-old child, he'd had a birthday 2 months after the trial, had developed an understanding of human nature that most adults never achieved. "Strength comes in different forms," I said. "You showed tremendous strength by staying silent when you had to and speaking up when it mattered. Your father is learning a different kind of strength now, the strength to face the truth about his choices and try to become better." The timer rang for our cookies, and as we pulled them from the oven, I reflected on how much our lives had changed. The kitchen that had once been a place of deception and danger was now filled with laughter and genuine conversation. The house that had felt like a trap was now a sanctuary where Damien could be himself without fear. "Mrs. Patterson from next door wants to know if you're feeling better," Damien said, referring to our neighbor who had been one of the first to notice positive changes in our household. "She said you seem more like yourself lately." Mrs. Patterson's observation was particularly meaningful because she was one of the neighbors Nyla had convinced that I was suffering from dementia. Seeing me return to my normal activities and cognitive function had been confusing for her until the truth about Nyla's crimes became public. "Tell Mrs. Patterson I'm feeling better than I have in years," I said, "and invite her over for cookies when these cool down." As we cleaned up our baking mess, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Margaret Chen, my lawyer, the week before. She'd called to inform me that Nyla's appeals had been denied and that her sentence would stand. "She'll be eligible for parole in 12 years, Margaret had said, "but given the nature of her crimes and the psychological evaluations, it's unlikely she'll be granted early release." 12 years. By the time Nyla was eligible for parole, Damien would be 21 and fully capable of protecting himself. I would be 78, hopefully still healthy enough to continue being his advocate and protector if needed. "Do you ever think about her?" Damien asked suddenly, as if he'd been reading my thoughts. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Do you?" "Not as much as I used to," he said. "Dr. Martinez says that's normal. She says when someone hurts you for a long time, it takes a while to stop expecting them to hurt you again." The resilience of children never ceased to amaze me, but I knew that Damien's recovery was ongoing. There were still nights when he had nightmares about being sent away, still moments when he flinched if someone spoke too sharply. But every day he grew stronger and more confident in his safety. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I asked, a question I'd never been able to ask him before. "A doctor," he said without hesitation. "Like Dr. Martinez, but for kids who can't talk because they're too scared. I want to help them find their voices." The idea that this child, who had suffered so much, wanted to dedicate his life to helping other children heal was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "That's a wonderful goal," I told him, "and I think you'll be excellent at it." "Will you help me study?" he asked. "For as long as I'm able," I promised. "And even after that, you'll have all the resources you need. I've made sure of it." That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Damien curled up beside me with a book, something he did every night now, making up for years of lost reading opportunities. "Grandma," he said, looking up from his pages, "do you think we're safe now? Really safe?" It was the question that went to the heart of everything we'd endured and everything we'd overcome. I considered my answer carefully, because I'd learned that this remarkable child deserved nothing less than complete honesty. "I think we're as safe as anyone can be in this world," I said finally. "But more importantly, we know how to recognize danger now. We know how to protect each other, and we know that our voices matter." He nodded thoughtfully, then returned to his book. As darkness settled around us and the porch light cast a warm circle of illumination, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment of peace. Nyla had tried to silence us both, me through poison and manipulation, Damien through fear and intimidation. She had nearly succeeded in destroying our family and our lives. But in the end, the truth had proven stronger than her deception. The silence she had imposed on us had been shattered, replaced by open communication, honest love, and the kind of security that comes from knowing you can trust the people around you. As I tucked Damien into bed that night, he looked up at me with those intelligent brown eyes that no longer had to hide their awareness. "I love you, Grandma," he said simply. "I love you too, sweetheart," I replied. "Sweet dreams. No more nightmares," he said confidently. "Dr. Martinez says nightmares go away when you feel really safe." Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.